Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Chief Information Officer of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mr. Jack Gumtow.
Good morning. Thanks for coming back. There was a lot going on last night. I think everybody had a pretty good time. I think I showed up at every one of the socials. And for me, I think the count was 11. And I feel pretty good this morning. Hey, I'm just standing up here. I got three things I want to do. First off, I'm trying, it's really difficult to see with the lights. Is Valerie out there from my team, did the video, and Crystal? You guys out here? Nope. That's okay. I'll do that later. The second one is I was remiss in some of my duties yesterday, and on Sumo Doug, our MC, it happened to be his birthday, and so I'm going to say happy birthday, belated by a day. Oh, it is today. Oh, perfect. I think he turned 30. And the last thing I wanted to do before he comes up and speaks is I want to make an announcement on next year. So I've had a lot of people talk to me about what's the next one. We were going to do it on Wednesday, and Alyssa said, hey, can you do it today? So next year's DoDIIS conference will be at, switch to commercial, and come back, Phoenix. And it's 2 to 5 August in Phoenix, Arizona. So, and with that, Doug, over to you.
All right, thank you, Jack. Before we get started with the day, a few administrative updates for this morning. First, wanted to start by thanking Ice and Pie for hosting the social last night. Thank you very much. Yesterday, there were also 2 sessions that were very popular, and as a result, they're going to be repeated today. The first is the Mars update, which will be held from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock in room 17. Again, that's 2 to 3 in room 17. And then Ms. Karen Mumford, the director of the Office of Small Business Programs, is going to repeat her presentation in DIA booth 411 at 2:30 to 3. So that's booth 411, that's the DIA booth from 2:30 to 3. And Mr. William Hancock, who was scheduled to brief at that time, will now give his presentation in the DIA booth on Wednesday at 10:30 to 11. So all those updates are also on your mobile app. So this morning, we're going to start with our first speaker, who's Mr. John Sherman, the CIO of the intelligence community and a good friend of mine. A little background on John. Following his graduation from Texas A&M, he served as a U.S. Army defense officer in the 24th Infantry Division, and he started his career in 1997 as a CIA imagery analyst assigned to the former NPIC. That's National Imagery. That's the predecessor to the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, and now known as NGA. He has served as the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence for military issues, and he's also been in the White House Situation Room as a duty officer, and recently also held executive positions at NGA dealing with analysis, collection, homeland security, and international affairs. Prior to his appointment as CIO in September of 2017 for the intelligence community, he was the Deputy Director of CIA's Open Source Enterprise. I asked John an interesting fact about himself, and he told me his first run-in with the law was not having his life vest on his boat in Mustang Bay. And I really honed in on that first run-in with the law, so that means there are more. So I'm sure he's going to come up and share those as well. So welcome, John Sherman.
Thank you, Doug. So yeah, Doug asked me about, what's an interesting factoid about myself. So Mr. Andres of NGA and I are both from Texas. And being Texans, we have certain stories we can share. But yeah, getting that first polygraph, have you ever had any run-ins with the law? Well, yes, sir, I have. I did not have a proper flotation device on my watercraft when I was red fishing in South Texas. But anyway, if that's the worst I did, then I think I came out pretty well. So it's great to be here with you today. Jack, Phoenix, man, it's going to be hot down there. I'm thinking Detroit in winter, maybe we could do a winter DoDIIS, but it's going to be great. We'll be down near the Army's Intel Center at Huachuca, and a really nice part of the country there. No humidity, Jack, that's right. So thanks for the introduction. It's an absolute honor to be here with all of you at DoDIIS today. And as mentioned, DoDIIS really has become the premier information technology, data, and cybersecurity event for the intelligence community. And Jack, I'm grateful to you and your entire team here for putting this on, because it's a great opportunity for us to talk about key issues. Now, I'm here to provide you with an update today on where we're at on the second epic of the intelligence community information technology enterprise, or ISITE as it's known, as well as some other key developments in what we call the intelligence community information environment. I spoke at last year's DoDIIS in Omaha about our goals for ISITE's second epic, and today I'm going to address the progress we made on this important endeavor. Now, before I jump in, Doug had indicated accurately that I began my career in the intelligence community as an imagery analyst working for the CIA. I was hired in the waning days of the former National Photographic Interpretation Center, or NPIC, just as the new National Imagery and Mapping Agency, NEMA, was standing up. Now, I've got many war stories with which I will not bore you today, but there's one that I always find illustrative when I'm talking with large groups like you all about something that you've been tracking for many years. Now, it was in the late 1990s, and I was in a meeting to welcome and provide imagery intelligence briefs to a new deputy division chief who had come over from the mapping side of NEMA from the former Defense Mapping Agency. Now, one of my colleagues, who I'm going to leave nameless in here, sometimes like to use big 50-cent words to demonstrate his gravitas. So when welcoming our new deputy division chief, this individual, perhaps seeking a phrase that had the word super in it, confidently stated to the new manager that he found her arrival to be superfluous. And he looked forward to providing that briefing. Now, in South Texas, we're sometimes not the most academic of folks, but I knew that superfluous didn't mean super duper or particularly esteemed. Of course, the actual definition of the word is, and I quote, unnecessary, especially through being more than enough, unquote. So this always reminds me that I don't ever want to be superfluous in these talks about where we are on ISITE and to focus on the so what part of an update, which is exactly what I plan to do with you this morning. Now, in a nutshell, we define the second epic of ISITE as being the current phase we've been leading for about the past 2 years under the guidance of former PDD&I Sue Gordon and her fellow deputies, whereby we're building on the amazing, indeed groundbreaking progress that began under our previous intelligence community leadership. I've said and will continue to say that we're beyond indebted to our predecessors for their vision to launch ISITE, because without them, I'm convinced we'd still be staring at PowerPoint charts and graphs. They made it real and created a foundation that benefits us now in the IC every single day. That doesn't mean, however, that we're not responsible to make ISITE even better, making hard changes where necessary and also building upon our progress. We'd be derelict in our duties if we just let our predecessors' work ride for the coming years. We've learned lessons, gained a better understanding of many dynamics, and seen a vastly changing technology environment, not to mention experiencing an evolving threat landscape and receiving many new mission requirements. This has truly been a case of us needing to evolve or losing the relevance and applicability of what we've built. And I can assure you that's not going to happen on any of our watches. I've spoken frequently of our watershed decision, now nearly 2 years ago, to pivot away from the pursuit of a common desktop, known as the IC Desktop Enterprise, or DTE for short. This was and remains a very noble effort that involved extensive work on both the government and industry sides of the equation. However, for a host of reasons, it wasn't meant to be, and we were definitely going to lose momentum had we tried to force it any longer. It was among the hardest decisions that any of us have ever had to make, but as the old adage goes, sunk costs mustn't dictate future decisions. And once we implemented this change, it opened up for us a whole new way of envisioning ISITE. No longer would we be focused on one-size-fits-all solutions, but rather we can move to a more federated approach that ensures interoperability without forcing agencies to compromise on their particular requirements, for integrating with their enterprises, all of which support a wide array of missions with unique security requirements and other aspects. As I noted at last year's DoDIIS conference, if we had turned the rear stat all the way to the do in common what is commonly done side of the dial in the first epoch of eyesight, we were moving it to the other direction just a bit, not all the way back over to the wild west of everyone do your own thing all the time, but somewhere in the middle. The key to achieving and thriving in this new paradigm has been our work since 2018 on reference architectures, and I'm pleased to say that we're making huge progress on this front. While this type of work is certainly not new to the ICCIO, the difference now has really been the participation of the agencies. Put another way, it's not something being done to them, but rather a framework on which they've been key contributors. Also, most importantly, the involved agencies made the commitment to send their very best and brightest to the meetings, and not just someone to attend, and that has made all the difference. Some of these individuals are in the audience today, such as Percival from NGA, Gil from NSA, and others, and I want to publicly thank every one of you for your commitment. Now, as a result of their participation, we're seeing real progress on the reference architecture work, such as enabling the functionality that we were aiming to achieve with the desktop environment. For example, we at the Office of Director of National Intelligence on the high side can now chat with our colleagues at the National Security Agency, and as Mark Hawken knows, we do this almost every day, and this is no small feat. And very recently, we can now do that with our colleagues at NGA, DIA, and U.S. Coast Guard. We've extended this philosophy as well with reference architectures for Identity, Credential, and Access Management, or ICAM, as well as with a data reference architecture. These have been massive, difficult issues for the IC, ICAM, and data, but nonetheless critical to our ability to both tag the data and the people and then unlock the power of the IC's information. The pick and shovel work we're doing with reference architectures is helping us get beyond the agency-centric approaches and instead use a framework that encourages true interoperability. This gets to one of the defining characteristics of the second epoch of eyesight. If our predecessors were the visionary pioneers heading westward, then we're the builders coming in behind them to shore up the buildings so they can truly endure. I almost feel like we ought to have some tools and blueprints in our hands as we're working on these reference architectures, as the effect is the same as if we're adding structure to an existing building. We're making it stronger and more enduring. To hear more about the reference architecture work, please join our IC Chief Architect, Dr. Cynthia Mendoza, fellow Aggie, by the way, who heads up our architecture and integration activities in room 25 at 2 p.m. today to hear more. Now, I'll tell you, Cynthia is the most motivated architect I've ever met, and she just projects enthusiasm for this critical work, and I believe if you see her presentation, it will be time well spent. Meanwhile, we're building on a major success of the first epoch involving cloud technologies. We've enjoyed a true transformation with our move to the cloud, embodied by our widespread use of what we call Commercial Cloud Services, or C2S, which is run by the Central Intelligence Agency and provided ably to us by Amazon Web Services, or AWS. While this commercial cloud topic could more than fill up its own presentation, I would just add today that we benefited greatly from what we've learned in this commercial cloud activity, and our workloads and data in the cloud exceed that of even what the most optimistic advocates could have envisioned when we started the C2S contract now over 5 years ago. Our focus for several years now has been on the top secret environment with C2S, but we're also making strides moving workloads into secret C2S, which AWS hosts under the same contract with CIA and for which the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency serves as our IC lead. Given that much of our IC data can be handled at the secret classification, especially for uses such as military and homeland purposes, Secret C2S really raises the potential of where we plan to go with this additional aspect of our cloud services. Also, in the same vein of providing compute and data hosting where they're most needed, we've been impressed to see the deployment of edge node capabilities in overseas locations. A number of agencies, to include NGA, NRO, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, have all been making great strides in this area, and this is truly eyesight in action at the point of mission users. We've done so well as an IC enterprise in leveraging commercial cloud technology, of course, after much evolution in areas like moving from a capital expenditure to an operations expenditure model, and posturing our workforce to leverage cloud services, that we're moving to the next phase of our journey with what we're calling the Commercial Cloud Enterprise, or C2E for short. I've spoken about C2E in other venues, and will just note that this future procurement builds upon our successes with C2S and involves our consideration for a number of new approaches in several areas. It's both a testament to our intelligence community agility as well as our enterprise maturity in the space that we're able to even contemplate moving even more broadly into this sort of cloud environment. It's not just about utility and elastic commercial compute for us, however. We're also continuing to benefit from the NSA-run IC GovCloud, which is really a high-performance analytic environment leveraging NSA's vast SIGINT data holdings. IC GovCloud is an arrow, very specialized arrow in our quiver that requires its users to be data conversant and savvy with its capabilities, and it provides a powerful complement to what we do in the commercial cloud space. We've recently engaged in some much-needed discussions about how we can best leverage IC GovCloud's impressive capabilities. As many of you know, early in the iSight story, the mantra for IC GovCloud was, bring us all of your data. And that was certainly a big goal, analyzing the bulk of the IC's data with the massive SIGINT data holdings, but it didn't take into account things like data curation and other needs, to include workforce understanding how to interact with IC GovCloud, which would be necessary to harness its full potential not just for the National Security Agency, but for other IC components as well. We're having these hard discussions as part of the second epic of iSight, and I will note that agencies such as CI and others have realized the power of IC GovCloud for a range of mission applications once they got their arms around the data aspects and other important offerings. Finally, there are other cloud technologies we're readily embracing, such as cloud-hosted managed services, which includes Microsoft's provision of Office 365 via their Azure cloud. We know the industry is moving to such cloud-hosted services, and as we work through the unique requirements of the IC, such as our current need to keep much of our data on our own premises, we're realizing the potential that this new approach can hold for us beyond the legacy licensing way of doing business. You all in industry are adapting, and so must we. Regarding these and other cloud activities, I'm pleased to note that we recently completed the strategic plan for advancing cloud computing in the intelligence community, which the Texan in me likes to simply refer to as our IC Cloud strategy, which again involved the same types of best and brightest officers from across the interagency to help us get the reference architectures right. I had the privilege a few weeks ago of signing off on this flagship document, which articulates our North Star for where we're heading in terms of cloud. Mr. John Schultz, who led the development of this cloud strategy in ICCIO, with all of our interagency teammates, will brief a breakout session in room 25 at 4 p.m. today, and we'll be providing copies of this new document, some of which we've already put out. If you're interested in where we're going in terms of IC Cloud, you'll definitely want to hear John's presentation. While world-class computing technologies are a foundational part of our intelligence community story, we can't be fully successful if we don't unlock the power of the IC's extensive data holdings. I mentioned the data reference architecture that we're developing, and our collaboration with the IC Chief Data Officer, Ms. Nancy Morgan, who's here with us today, and her colleagues throughout the 17 agencies has been absolutely critical. I often note that iSight's second epic's bumper sticker might be that we're finally going to make good on the promise that, quote, data is an IC asset, unquote. If the cloud compute technology we've deployed is the Formula One race car, then the data is the high-octane fuel that we must have to win the race. You simply can't have one without the other. To that end, we've made significant investments in what we call data services, which involve the capabilities and activities that enable us to know what data we have, access the data in accordance with an officer's credentials, hence the importance of ICAM, and then do amazing things with the data, like provide heretofore unknown insights against the hardest of the hard targets. Now, this perhaps sounds straightforward, but it's been among the heaviest lifts you can imagine. And getting data services right is not only going to be critical for unlocking our data, but also to build the foundation for areas like artificial intelligence and machine learning, which, as many of you know, we call augmenting intelligence using machines, or AIM in the IC. Even cataloging our data sets, not the discrete data itself, has been eye-opening. As we've had mission leaders discovering that parts of their enterprises had data that was not made available to analysts, collectors, and others who needed it on some very high priority issues. This was not a result of hoarding or malice, but rather that we have not previously attacked this data issue at quite anywhere near this level before. Now, I've laid out 3 of the big focus areas for Second Epic to include architectures, cloud, and data. They are beyond critical for us to get right, but there's another perennial focus area that we've elevated to be on the very same par, if not higher, than our modernization activities that tend to get all this external attention. This area, as you might guess, is cybersecurity. Under the leadership that Sue Gordon provided, who really acted as a driving force behind getting the entire IC enterprise in a better, more secure place, we recently completed our new IC Cybersecurity Implementation Plan, or CIP for short, which, like our cloud strategy, is available in room 25. The CIP, while extensive, really involves just 3 core aspects. 1, know your enterprise. 2, manage your enterprise. And 3, share the state of your enterprise. Earlier this year, I signed out guidance to the 17 IC agencies to launch a comprehensive inventory of all of their IT systems, to include all of the edge, quote-unquote backroom, and so-called shadow IT that is resident in just about every single organization. Using a new approach that we call the Cybersecurity Performance Evaluation Model, we started just this last month to receive our first tranche of SIP-related asset inventory data into our IC Security Coordination Center, or ICSCC, which, along with our cybersecurity folks and the IC CISO community, has been a driving force behind getting this new posture in place. The interagency coordination of the CIP was very ably led by IC Chief Information Security Officer, Ms. Sue Dorr, who's here with us today, who addressed this plan very well in a breakout yesterday. Sue and the rest of us, as she noted, recognize that today's threats demand that we move more quickly and comprehensively to shore up our entire IC enterprise, as we are truly only as strong as our weakest link, hence our focus on edge, backroom, and elsewhere. Patching is not something we're going to put off under my watch. The ICSCC, which I'll discuss momentarily, is our fulcrum for IC-wide threat information sharing. And while none of this would be happening without strong interagency leadership, I also need to credit our colleagues at the National Security Agency for readily sharing their lessons learned with all of us on how they strengthen their enterprise following some well-publicized disclosures and other issues. I mentioned the role that the ICSCC in our collective cybersecurity activities, and the individuals there at that center certainly punch above their weight in my book. DIA is the lead for this service, and the leadership is provided by a powerful combination of OD&I, DIA, and CIA officers with reps and MBIDs from all across our interagency. In addition to serving as a focal point for receiving the SIP-related data from agencies, as well as routinely issuing warnings to the IC about threat activities, the ICSCC also runs extensive cybersecurity exercises in which IC participation has increased exponentially over the past several years. And they've recently worked with NSA to leverage IC GovCloud's impressive capabilities for cyber threat data analysis. Finally, the team at the center has also developed a C2S hosted capability which is seen as a cybersecurity best practice by our colleagues at Department of Homeland Security and elsewhere. Now, Wally Coggins, the director of this impressive organization, will be talking more about these activities and capabilities in a breakout session tomorrow, again in room 25 at 10:30 a.m. Those are some of the main priorities of iSight's Second Epic: architecting a federated interoperable enterprise, building on our world-class computing with cloud and other capabilities, unlocking the power of the IC's data, and strengthening our cybersecurity posture. These are not just aspirational goals, but tasks on which we're moving out aggressively. While they are our main efforts, they're not the totality of our work across the IC information environment. I've spoken about additional focus areas in other venues, and for the sake of brevity, I'll just highlight a few of them there. Now, first, as very capably highlighted by Major General Howard yesterday, we continue to work for greater interoperability with all of our allied partners. We meet in what we call the CIO Forum, and last year we stood up what we call a Virtual Program Office, or PMO, to coordinate the development of new capabilities like secure file transfer, chat, and other services among the allies. We're also currently exploring the stand-up of a potential full-time program executive office where we can have full-time, in-person representation with subject matter experts to continue these efforts even more extensively. Next, we continue to build upon the successes to establish enterprise-level agreements with numerous industry partners. Now, as you know, these arrangements can simplify things for us on the IC side as well as the companies providing the services, as they're not negotiating separately with 17 different organizations, and we on the government side are able to see efficiencies from a single arrangement for a particular service or services. While eyesight, especially in our second epic, is truly about mission capabilities, our work to institute these enterprise-level agreements has been great for efficiencies across the board and truly a best practice for us. Also, we've increased our focus on technology to support accessibility for IC employees who have some type of disability, as we are seeing this as so much more than simply compliance. We want to assure that every single officer can bring her or his very best skills to the fight. In concert with colleagues like ODNI, EEOD, and other stakeholders, Defense Intelligence Agency has stepped up to help shepherd us through new approaches and ways to leverage some of the very best practices already in play across many of the agencies. We're extending this philosophy as well to medical device accessibility. Meanwhile, we've worked to improve our relationship with our congressional overseers over the past 2 years. As many of you know, eyesight had been a rather contentious topic, but now, via our responsiveness to oversight requirements in areas such as quarterly briefings and our twice-a-year eyesight long-term roadmaps, I think we've been able to demonstrate effective leadership and delivery in the eyesight and IE core services. Scott Miller, if you're out there, you can answer questions about this afterwards. Scott's on the HIPS end. He's seen us quite a bit here in the past 2 years. Last but certainly not least, we continue to work on our other shared services that might not get the same attention as areas like cloud and data, but which are critical to our success all the same. These include areas like network requirements in engineering, or NRE, Information Transport Service, or ITS, the Apps Mall, our classification management tool, and Intel Link, just to name a few. Now, as I get ready to wrap up, I focused a lot on the what aspects of the eyesight second epic, but I'd remiss if I also didn't talk about the how. Plain and simple, the secret sauce in all this has been the teamwork among the IC agencies, and none of this would be possible without each organization leaning in and providing some type of service or expertise, as with C2S or IC GovCloud or many others, and ensuring they have all the right experts in the right meetings, just as we've had for activities such as the IC Cloud Strategy and the Cybersecurity Implementation Plan. We meet routinely in CIO Council meetings, and we also hold joint sessions with our Chief Data Officer counterparts throughout the year. The PDD&I and the IC deputies provide direct oversight and feedback regularly through an eyesight secure VTC monthly that we host, and the defining features of these second epic meetings is candor, all-in collaboration, and joint commitment. Additionally, we in the IC CIO, with the ODNI Enterprise Capacity Directorate, conduct collaborative, intensive oversight of eyesight and information environment activities via routine program reviews. We recently renamed these sessions Melissa Driscoll Reviews, or MDRs, in honor of the former DIA deputy who left us way too early last fall, and who consistently demonstrated the highest levels of programmatic oversight and rigor. We always aspire to provide the same level of excellence that Melissa would expect for us in such an important set of eyesight activities. I could go on here, but I think you've got the idea of what we're doing with Eyesight's second epic, and I hope that in my remarks, some key themes have started to emerge. Things like momentum, teamwork, relentless innovation, a willingness to make needed improvements, and again, commitment. I intentionally emphasize this last word as perhaps the most important of them all. With Eyesight, we're talking about a program and set of concepts that began at least over 7 years ago, which persist and continue to go strong here in the year 2019, with years of key activities planned for our future. Indeed, we're already beginning to think about what Eyesight's third epic might look like, which my colleague, Deputy ICCIO Linnea Jones, did a great job of addressing in a session yesterday afternoon, which I hope many of you had a chance to see. I'm very honored as the ICCIO to be part of this Eyesight project, which has endured through multiple leadership turnovers across presidential administrations, new technology opportunities and more than a few challenges, and the involvement of an enterprise that involves 17 different organizations, many of whom actually report up through different departments. Ponder that for just a moment, and then realize we've not only been able to hold this grand endeavor together, but indeed make our IC technology modernization an exemplar for the rest of the government. And that, my friends, is not superfluous. Thank you for your time today, and thanks for what all of you do to support our IC endeavors. It's an honor to work with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was great. As John mentioned, we've swung the pendulum in the IC, in the CIO community, from doing in common what was commonly done to interoperability, and we've come a long way in the past 2 years under John's leadership. Our next speaker is Ms. Jean Schaffer, who's the Chief of our Cyber and Enterprise Operations at DIA. She came to us in November of 2017 after spending more than 30 years at the National Security Agency. And in her current role, she leads a global IT organization that focuses on cybersecurity, IT operations and services, as well as information insurance for the agency, but also for combatant commands, joint staff, various DoD elements, and IC customers. Fun fact about Jean is that she does her own electrical work at home, and she has yet to burn down her house. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jean Schaffer.
To just spend a little bit time with you diving to the next level on the topic of cybersecurity for both JWICS and DoDIIS. You heard yesterday from General Ashley that he is really placing a great emphasis on making sure that as the executive agent for JWICS, we are providing the services that are needed from anyone who uses JWICS, whether it be the intel agencies or primarily our DoD customers who use this more and more every day with increased demand for it. So without any further ado, I just wanted to highlight what our DIA environment kind of looks like. So we are the global IT enterprise provider for all of the DoD combatant commands, the strategic sites, as well as our tactical edge. We really feel our job is that integration of the J2s with the rest of the intelligence community to make sure that we're delivering the data where it's needed and at the right places. We operate across multiple networks from unclassified all the way up to top secret, and we also sponsor and operate many of our coalition networks, as we heard yesterday, because coalition is how we fight our wars. So as you can imagine, all of those networks are under a constant attack. So if you think about what happens every day in the private industry, on the internet, if you expand upon that, we are facing the same attacks on all of our networks. And so what we need to do is actually make sure that there are no kinks in the armor all the way across our networks worldwide so that we can continue to support that. So just to let you know, DIA kind of governs JWICS since we're the executive agent, but just like the NIPRNet and the SIPRNet, all of the entities that connect up to JWICS kind of have their own domains. So part of what we are doing is making sure we're setting that security bar at the appropriate level to make sure that there's not a risk when we're adding new sites and new entities to JWICS. And we're trying to raise that security posture as we continue to deliver those diverse mission solutions that are needed. We also try to help prioritize the delivery of data because every mission needs a slightly different emphasis. So working with the commands, we're trying to prioritize exactly how and to make sure that those sites that are needed get the most capacity as well as the extra emphasis to make sure it's there. We talked about security. We really are trying to do proactive defense across the board. I talk about networks a lot, but we also operate information domains that we call DoDIIS. Again, all various classification levels and including our coalition networks that we operate. the data centers, the clouds, both the commercial clouds that John just talked about, as well as private clouds that DIA runs, is also part of our purview. Enterprise applications that many of you use, as well as the rest of the enterprise infrastructure. Most of JWICS, the network, we ride on top of DISA. We partner very well with DISA over their DoDIIS network. So what really are our goals, right? Our goals are very simple. They can be described in a great fashion, right? We want it to be reliable. We need it to be resilient. We need it to be survivable. And survivable takes on many different aspects, right? Whether or not we're talking hemp survivable or just survivable to make sure if a fiber cut occurs, we can reroute it a different way. It needs to be accessible to the different places that is needed for our mission customers, whether that be at the edge or back here somewhere in the CONUS regions. And it needs to be scalable, because as I mentioned earlier, we see a higher demand continuing to be placed onto JWICS. And of course, cybersecurity is integral to that entire thing. So what we are doing here at DIA is just trying to make cybersecurity part of our normal business rhythm. Instead of in the past waiting until you're getting ready to plug something in and say, oh, by the way, I need to be accredited. We're trying to really do this the right way and make sure everyone understands what are the minimum security requirements, how can you do that, and go ahead and build that in from the get-go. So we talked a little bit about JWICS modernization. I mentioned a couple of times we do have an increased demand. We only believe that demand will continue to increase over the next decade or so. And what we're looking at is how are we going to balance that with further hardening against our threats, right? JWICS is already hardened because primarily it is a top secret SCI network. So it is hardened to that level to start. But we really need to raise the security posture because our threats are not only coming from external, but we need to make sure we're protecting ourselves from internal threats. As we continue to expand the JWICS, the top secret population, that's more and more folks that we're going to be putting on our high level network, and we need to just make sure we can identify any internal threats through various mechanisms and make sure that we can handle that. We're also transitioning from a network protection model to a data protection model. So you have heard many conversations up to date, and you will continue to hear them through the rest of this conference that really talks about focusing on that data. Focusing on that data means that we really are going to have to understand and clearly define the on and off ramps for JWICS, the network. We really will need to make sure we have crisp domain edges, because how are we going to know our entire environment unless we have those edges defined and we make sure all of those assets are managed appropriate by the appropriate folks. And we're going to have defined data flows. So we're going to need to understand more and more what data needs to get to what locations and actually define that so we can ensure that there's multiple paths to get there in case there's any diversion or distraction from a network outage or just from a particular path that data should go through. So what does this mean? This means a result in we're really looking at JWICS and kind of doing an overhaul of both the architecture and how we've laid it out to make sure we're meeting the needs that all of you guys rely on JWICS for. So as you've heard, we're right now addressing both USDI. We're working hand in hand with USDI and the DoD to make sure as we're developing the new architecture for JWICS, it truly is meeting your needs. So the other thing we're doing internally, so John talked a lot about how the IC is focused on cybersecurity and have laid out some various points that they would like each of us as agencies to make sure we're doing. In DIA, we call this securing DoDIIS. It is not only looking at the points that John and the rest of the CISOs have actually outlined, but it's looking at all of the IT services that we provide across the board. and making sure that those services are actually up to snuff from a security point of view. We run a lot of legacy applications, a lot of legacy hardware. We're looking at that across the board to see what and how we can continue to replace that and make sure that it's actually providing the needs. So anything from we're implementing two-factor authentication for our user base, which I know if you think about your CAC cards, you've done that on the NIPRNet quite a while ago. We're looking at doing some of those similar things on JWICs on the top secret network. So a couple of the other things that we really are doing are we're making sure that we're integrating some of our systems. So our HR systems, our personnel systems, right, kind of have to be integrated in with some of our IT systems to make sure we know exactly who is on the network, what are they accessing, giving them the proper credentials to make sure that they can receive that data that they need to do their mission. So all of that is kind of folded underneath the term of securing the DoDIIS. I know we have a couple of breakout groups. They started yesterday. There's some more that my team's doing today. Various aspects of that. So if you can, go ahead and catch some of those. So when we look at cybersecurity at large, right, there really is three pieces to this puzzle. And this isn't rocket science. Most of you know this, right? It is required people, processes, and technology. A lot of what we're trying to do today is to make sure that we're addressing the people piece, right? Cybersecurity, we need more and more cybersecurity experts. We need academia to help make sure that they're producing the best of those cybersecurity experts. But everyone in the world is actually vying for those same resources. We get our fair share, just like everyone else, but the other thing we're trying to figure out is how do we fill those gaps? What else can we do differently to maybe fill some of those cybersecurity needs that we have? And so what we're continuing to do is look and recruit some of our network and our systems engineers, have them actually the folks who are running our networks, running and developing our systems, taking some of them once they understand how those systems work, and then introducing a lot of the cybersecurity techniques that are taught in school so that they can then become some of the defenders that we're looking for in the future. So government, private industry, Jack talked a little bit about this yesterday, the millennials. We want them to rotate in and out from the government to private industry. The mechanisms, we're still struggling sometimes at that, but that is a goal that we have from the government because we need to share that knowledge. Processes, when we look at our processes, we really are trying to go to a digital transformation. And what that means is not just take the existing process we have and automate it, but look at how we can streamline it, look at how we can make that process better. Over the years, we can do a whole bunch more with actually making our processes more efficient from the get-go. So there's a huge effort that we have underway to look across the board at our processes and how we're going to do that. What we really want in the cybersecurity arena, when you look in specifically for cyber network defense, we want to use the industry offerings, right? We're relying on the industry offerings to be that first cut, that first initial alerting of things that might not look right, any anomalous behavior. And then what we're doing is we're leveraging some data scientists to actually develop the analytics so that we can do computer speed, computer network defense, right? Using our bright and our best folks to really oversee that, take a look, and figure out how do you put the human element for those larger problems. But for the first part, we really should get to the point that some of this is purely automated. So we really are striving for an adaptive environment. And emerging technologies, we continue to have to evolve, right? That's just the state of the nature that we live in. So many of the technologies that are coming out today, we will be adopting within DIA or across our top secret networks, and we need to figure out how do we actually bring those in and how do we integrate them. So my request for everyone in industry is really the products that you're building, please make sure that they're consumable, scalable, and easy to deploy. Because the last thing we need is for you to produce products and then the government side have to really work on figuring out how do we integrate that. If we're doing more plug and play, it makes our life and everyone's life much easier. So we just have to think a little bit about how we can solve some of our challenges differently. So what is DIA's vision for combating our increasing cyber threats? Okay, this is pretty basic in my world, but if you just develop your baseline of what is normal, when anomalous events occur, that is when the alert should be flying, right? Whether it's you're seeing someone move a large portion of data from one area to another area, someone should be asking the question of why. It was really interesting on Saturday when I was putting together these briefings. I was over at the Marriott, and I called a couple of colleagues together and said, hey, come preview the slides for me. And as many of you would think, you flip the switch, right? Because they're going to be coming into your room and you don't have to keep getting up. The miraculous part is within 5 minutes, my phone was ringing. It was security from Tampa, from the hotel, saying, ma'am, I noticed your door is not closed all the way. Are you in duress? Please press 1 if you can't speak. Otherwise, just let us know if you need some help. And I was like, oh my God, I'm blown away. No, I'm really fine. I actually did flip the lock on purpose. And they're like, we just wanted to check on you. So when you're looking at normal baseline activity, think about this. There's a certain amount of time they usually allow folks to come into your room, right, and your door would be closed. If it goes over something, there was some alert that was thrown. They picked up the phone and called. Wouldn't that be nice if we can figure out how to do that for some of our IT things? That's kind of what I'm talking about, a normal baseline activity. The other things we would need to do is configure tools to alert. Just like I'm sure there wasn't someone, a human being, sitting there looking at all the doors opening and closing. There was some alert that was thrown, and they're actually picking up the phone and taking action. You feed all of that information into a central source, right? Whether it's cloud-centric, whether it's something on the edge, processing occurs, and then the first line of defense happens. Humans, again, like I talked to, we wanted our cybersecurity experts should be the ones who's determining how far the first initial response needs to be. Is there other things we need to put together? Is there something going on that perhaps in the environment the computers just don't know about, but a human being may? And then, of course, as we're going through this cycle, it is a cycle. So you're continually pushing this back in to apply to your operational networks and the services that you apply. So that's kind of our vision for where we're trying to get across the board with increasing our cyber threats. So our journey ahead, where are we really going? So we are undergoing a digital transformation. It may or may not be the term in vogue at the moment, but what this is all about is not fixing something that's broken, but changing our mindsets. Changing our mindsets to actually think about what we need to do, set us up ahead of time. Just like you heard yesterday, we don't want to have to wait until we're under some massive cyber attack to then try to figure out what our response is going to be. We need to get ahead of the curve, start looking at this, and how are we going to meet those adversaries head on? How are we going to do this to make sure that our defense and the rest of our intelligence customers can do what they need to do? So that's where DIA is in our movie picture. We have a journey ahead that we need to go, but We're well under our way, and we have a whole lot of folks, both the academia and industry, joining us hand in hand to try to get there. So that's about all I have to do today. If y'all do have any questions, feel free to catch me around. I will be here for the next 2 full days, and I also have my staff who will be able to answer some of your more technical questions. But thanks a lot for listening. I hope you have a good day.
Thank you, Jean. Our next speaker is Mr. John Doyon, who is the Chief Data Officer and Director of Data Strategy and Innovation at the National Counterterrorism Center. In this role, he leads the center's strategy for acquiring data, analyzing data, and safeguarding that data to ensure protection of privacy and civil liberties. He has over 40 years of experience working national security and intelligence issues and began his career as an NSA analyst in 1985. He served as the Chief Strategist for the Signals Intelligence Directorate, Senior NSA Representative to DoD at the Pentagon, and also as the Global Capabilities Manager for Leading SIGINT Analysis and Production. Fact about John is that he served 20 years and has been with 20 years in the symphonic choir and has performed more than 80 times at the Kennedy Center. So more interesting as we move along through our guests. So please welcome John Doyon.
Thank you. Good morning, and I'm sorry to disappoint. I am not going to sing today. But good morning. It is a privilege to be here with you to talk about some of the big data challenges that we face in the counterterrorism community. And as was said, my name is John Doyon. I'm the Chief Data Officer at the National Counterterrorism Center. And my boss, the director of NCTC, Joe McGuire, was supposed to be here with you today to share these remarks, but Joe was asked to do some other duties. So he asked me to come here and spend some time with you today. Now, I've been at the National Counterterrorism Center for about 3.5 years, and the last 2 years have been in the Chief Data Officer role. And I've been impressed with the dedication and commitment of the workforce to the CT mission to keep America safe. Many have been in the CT fight since 9/11 or even before. And one question you often get asked when you arrive at the NCTC is, where were you on 9/11? And I'm sure that we all have a story about how 9/11 affected us personally and professionally. One question that I like to ask people is, well, what technology did you have on 9/11? And looking back to the fall of 2001, as we all know, nobody had an iPhone, and nobody had a Twitter feed or an Instagram account or chatted with friends around the world using WhatsApp, or, well, I could go on for a long time here. You get the point. The proliferation of smartphones and laptops and various social media platforms have drastically changed both the amount and the structure of the communications data that we need to accomplish the CT mission. Today, it's rather astounding as to the enormous sum of data and data types that our analysts comb through every day. An often used metaphor in our community is about the haystack. The size of the haystack is getting larger, and the needle in the haystack continues to get smaller. It's clear that the CT enterprise is in a period of transition, and improving our ability to exploit increasing amounts of unstructured data is key to winning the fight. As Russ Travers, now again, acting director of NCTC, has stated, Russ states that data is the lifeblood of the center, and it really is. It's both a strategic asset and a strategic vulnerability. We have to get the electrons right, or we risk failing the country. So what does it mean to get the electrons right? Let's look at the specific types of data that we deal with at the Counterterrorism Center. First, we have our traditional classified data, intelligence reporting, largely unstructured. We also have non-intelligence data, things like passenger name records that we get. There's also captured enemy media from the battlefield, and there's the wealth of publicly available information that we obtain from open source. The center has approximately 400 data sets of all shapes and sizes. These data sets come to us from sources that include federal agencies, commercial entities, our foreign partners, and publicly available information. Overall, the data is largely unstructured, varying in size of holding, and we get it in either one-time bulk loads or real-time data feeds. Analysts can access more than 24 networks across the intelligence community with access to even more databases across the US government. There are different levels of access depending on the sensitivity of the data or depending on the sensitivity whether or not US person information is included in the data. Last, the reporting comes in completely different reporting formats at a rate of about 10,000 a day is what we receive at NCTC. And in those 10,000 reports are about 16,000 names. And as you might imagine, that's we're always looking for identities of potential terrorists. So 16,000 names in those reports. And they may be a partial name, a full name, a pseudonym. And this is what we're seeing every day. So if the volume, variety, and pace of the data were not challenged enough, the data's quality and value can differ a lot. We regularly have to contend with ambiguous, incorrect, or fabricated information. We also have to translate the data into some format allowing it to touch other data for analytic purposes. So from a data perspective, the haystack never stops growing. And the needle, or relevant data, continues to be more subtle and difficult to find. To be blunt, the amount of data we must review is growing exponentially larger than the resources we can apply to it. So why does this matter? Well, all the data challenges that the counterterrorism community faces, all the data challenges that we face, all the data challenges of CT, all of this data challenges our ability to reasonably analyze and then link across other seemingly innocuous data to find a CT connection. Obviously, it's impossible to comb through such vast amounts of data without relying on machine learning and other technical processes. However, it's vital to consider the legal and policy frameworks that are in place to help us maintain the trust of the nation, who expects us to keep them safe, but not necessarily at the cost of their rights. That brings me to the next point, focused on the efforts to enable data search and discovery. Legal, policy, and technical challenges. So there is a number of legal, policy, and technical challenges that NCTC and the Counterterrorism Intelligence Enterprise face daily in order to facilitate data search and discovery. First, from a legal angle, every department or agency in the federal government has unique authorities to collect, use, disseminate, and retain data. For NCTC to access information that other agencies collect, the center often has to negotiate complicated information sharing agreements that dictate how the center can use the information to include addressing retention as well as privacy and civil liberties protections. For example, complicating our efforts to analyze all of the available data is the variance in period that we are allowed to retain data to make a CT determination. So when we get data sets in, sometimes we're allowed to keep the data for a year or a year and a half or 2 years or some prescribed period of time. Now, there are innovative ways to solve this issue, including close coordination with our data providers, along with our partners from the Civil Liberties and Privacy Office, which leverage automation, encryption, and indexing to allow us to establish a terrorism nexus and therefore retain the information. So once we can, if we can take this data out of the data set and say, hey, there's actually a terrorist information here, then we can retain it indefinitely. Otherwise, we will have to purge it after some prescribed amount of time. Next, from a policy bend, we are no less challenged. Not surprisingly, just as each department has different authorities, they also have different policies on data use that NCTC can also be subject to. These policies differ greatly and cover everything from the format in which the data can be cataloged, to the systems the data can be stored in, to who can access the data, to what purpose can the data be used, and then the details of the compliance overlay, that is, agreeing to auditing and reporting requirements. So every different data set that we're getting in from one of our partners in government, for example, where we have one of these memorandums of agreement for use of the data, covers all of this in great detail, and it is challenging then for how we use and access that data. Lastly, technical issues. We are immediately challenged by the fact that there's no one data format to facilitate data search and discovery, which results in, for NCTC, in a bit more labor-intensive manual process required for analysts to find and connect data. Each agency formats its collected data to fulfill its mission and best address their specific, unique mission-related requirements and priorities. That's no surprise. A smartly implemented common data format, though, would accelerate the intelligence community's ability to identify relevant terrorism information. Also, and quite possibly the stickiest issue, the data isn't stored in one place for everyone to use, but rather is stored where it makes the most sense for the collecting agency to use it. To address these challenges, the CT intelligence enterprise is making informed investments in artificial intelligence and machine learning and other data exploitation architectures to tackle future threats as we continue to improve our legal, policy, and technical posture regarding data that is valuable to the CT mission. Despite these challenges, we are better at analyzing our data than ever before. We continually work across government to modernize our policies to better align our different authorities to support the CT mission. We are constantly innovating and modernizing our approach on how to access disparate data while maintaining a robust compliance system. Now, it's one thing to talk about big data from an executive perspective, but the real question is, how do all these issues affect analysts at NCTC that are charged with making sense of this data every day? So let me share a couple of stories with you. And each of the following stories I'll go through relates to charges to NCTC from our foundational document, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, or IRTPA. IRTPA, as many of you know, was signed into law by President Bush in 2004. And IRTPA states that NCTC will ensure that agencies have access to and receive counterterrorism intelligence. This includes ensuring that the White House, State Department, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and others have situational awareness of global counterterrorism issues and breaking events. IRTPA also states that NCTC serves as the central and shared knowledge bank of known and suspected terrorists and international terror groups. And the law also states that NCTC serves as the primary organization in the U.S. government for analyzing and integrating all intelligence pertaining to terrorism and counterterrorism. So with that as a backdrop, our authorities, let me go through a couple of those in a little bit more detail. The first story, so to accomplish and facilitate our situational awareness mission, the Center has access to all terrorism-related open source and classified reporting across the entire CT community. Supplemental to that is information from major news feeds and various social media platforms. Our 24/7 Operations Center focuses on information triage every day and selection of threshold reporting for our situational awareness that informs our partners across the CT community at the federal, state, and local levels. So how exactly is the sausage made during this data-intensive process? Step one, NCTC watch officers use filters that automatically highlight known terrorist identities, groups, and plots. These keyword filters are continually updated as new threat streams and actors are identified. There are over 24,000 keywords we're using currently. And remember, this is includes running these keywords against all 10,000 of those messages that are coming in new each day. Step 2, an item is selected for production and then tasked to a watch officer who researches in numerous classified databases and data sets that span the intelligence community. The watch officer develops a comprehensive picture of all identities contained in the report and the background information on the specific threat stream or plot, looking for things such as, is there a current watch list status for this person, or is there biometric information for the identities in the report? Is there previous travel history, or is there a visa status or citizenship information that we have? Are there any known relatives or associates that we are tracking? And then third, the NCTC officers are constantly vigilant for breaking events and terrorist attacks. So what does that entail? So let's imagine today, watch officers at NCTC are on duty, and they observe tweets about, say, an active shooter situation in a shopping mall. Perhaps initial reports indicate there's been gunfire, there have been people injured, and that police are responding. The watch officer would go into action and would immediately check additional news sites and social media platforms to verify we have an ongoing event, gathering basic facts of the incident as they are presently known. This includes looking at over 70 different news feeds, public information sites, and social media platforms for terrorism content and breaking events. Next, they would exchange information with FBI, with DHS, and with other IC watch centers, and the U.S. Secret Service. Once the shooter's been apprehended, or we know have a name, and they've been identified, analysts would run that biographic information through hundreds of databases to determine if there's any derogatory information on the individual. NCTC officers would also conduct checks of the subject's cell phone and travel history. And so what might we find? Well, we find things like perhaps there's a connection to a recent imam of a radical mosque who is a subject of FBI interest. Or perhaps there's been travel to Turkey or to Pakistan within the last few years. Perhaps we'll find a social media site and a social media footprint with nothing derogatory per se, but there's a Facebook posting from that day that says, today's going to be a big show. However, when we run this individual against the terrorism watch list database and other holdings, it comes back negative. So once again, we weren't tracking this person, and we had a negative, no information on him in our terrorism holdings. So this is just the start of a tracking event, but it highlights an important yet simple fact. The work is hard, and there's many, many people out there who would do us harm that we aren't tracking. We haven't had anything to tip us off to that yet. Okay, my second scenario is looking at our screening and vetting mission. So let's look at how analysts work screening and vetting for known and suspected terrorists using data and information sharing. So you may recall news stories from back in mid-2018 that the FBI arrested a US-based Iraqi refugee on a warrant of extradition based on homicide charges out of Iraq, which took place before he entered the US in November of 2014. So here I want to focus on a couple aspects of identifying this person. And this relates to the data-intensive challenges that we have to discover and confirm that an individual has terrorism links. So this individual's refugee application was screened before he came to the US in April of 2014. And at the time, he and several family members were in the Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment, also known as TIDE. However, the TIDE records contained very little biographic information, resulting in allowing him to travel to the US. Analysts had conducted 3 separate checks in screening systems and found no nexus to terrorism. And why? Well, because the information needed to make the connection was actually scattered across multiple US government organizations and different repositories of data. And foot stomping here, on this point, critical information was not processed because of the flood of data facing the CT community. New biographic or derogatory information had not been connected to his record. So, as information comes in, we hadn't gotten to the point where we were able to update his record with new information. Again, derogatory information on an individual may be in various holdings across the government, and discovering that can be difficult. Complicating matters more, in this case, the subject had 3 separate records because of name variations, differing surnames, and sparse data. So due to insufficient, sparse, and overlapping biographic information between his application data and the watch list records to validate the potential matches and meet the screening thresholds, analysts did not receive a prompt to evaluate him. Connections were ultimately made later in 2016 when a piece of data not previously examined enabled the link, and identity records were merged shortly thereafter. So I can't stress enough how scattered and unanalyzed and incomplete data within various U.S. government holdings can prevent the counterterrorism community from connecting the necessary information needed to create a holistic view of a subject's identity and connection to their terrorist activities. It's a difficult problem, and screening opportunities for us, for the U.S. government, exceed 2 million a day. So there's a pretty high expectation of the agility of the screening and vetting enterprise to screen 2 million items a day. Volumes of data and limited resources within the U.S. government only increase the risk of missing these threats. Despite this example, again, at the end of the day, we have improved at using data, and we've made some strides in sharing information. So this is a testimony to the ever-evolving progress we're making in the classified screening mission. And we're confident that our current capabilities, had they been in place back in 2014, would have, at least for this individual, identified him and his terrorist activities. The third scenario, and the last scenario in mission set I wanted to talk to you about, focuses on our analysis mission, and specifically analyzing and integrating intelligence. What I'll present for you is something illustrating what's become more frequent in the past 5 years: attacks by homegrown violent extremists, and in some cases, persons who are completely unknown and become radicalized after they enter the United States, or after they arrive in the United States. These require our attention despite the continued need to remain focused on the chance for externally directed attacks against the homeland. So in this scenario, let's imagine that an Uzbekistan-based extremist group has links to a known violent extremist ideologue who espouses attacking the West, especially the United States. The group is also suspected of sending fighters to support ISIS in Afghanistan. There's one named person in this group who reportedly attended college in the United States, is suspected of using multiple social media platforms linked to ISIS, and has recently posted calls to followers to attack the U.S. and to, quote, watch for something glorious. Separate intelligence reporting indicates a different Uzbekistan-based named extremist is planning attacks against the U.S. and contacting 2 prior acquaintances who live in the U.S. Key point here, NCTC and the Counterterrorism Intelligence Enterprise face the challenge of finding non-obvious links between pieces of information like this for threats in and against the homeland every day. How do these 2 Uzbek related pieces, is there any connection, is there any relation there? So how does the analyst begin putting together information and looking at this question? The analyst combs through intelligence reporting that the U.S. government already has to add context and expand our understanding of the operatives and their plots. And remember, every day we get another 10,000 messages, so the haystack keeps growing. The analyst next maps out the communications data for the known person in Uzbekistan and the persons mentioned who had U.S. associates. And as many of us know, publicly available information such as social media, messaging apps, telecommunications data, they pose extraordinarily complex challenges. And when you start to do this type of work, a single extensive network of contacts can have thousands of data points in them. across multiple communication platforms. The analyst then tries to determine if any associates of the known extremist are located in the homeland. Do they have valid visas? Are there links to the extremist who allegedly went to college in the United States? Do they have any suspect foreign travel? Supporting the analyst's efforts, NCTC, working with our partners, has increased its ability to do bulk correlation of data against all of the center's classified and unclassified holdings using innovative tools. But this situation still poses significant data processing challenges. Remember what I said earlier, the haystack never stops growing and the needle continues to be more subtle. So we must also apply data science to identify and extract different types of patterns in our data. But the patterns we extract are only useful if they give us some actionable insight. So these three stories are but a few examples of the data challenges we face every day at the National Counterterrorism Center to accomplish our mission. A few final thoughts to share with you this morning. We've discussed some ways that big data challenges impact the counterterrorism mission, but there are a few other points I'd like to highlight. Since 9/11, the counterterrorism enterprise has made huge advances and improvements in its ability to share, process, and use information and data. That said, we still have further to go, and we can't grow complacent. The terrorists have also been at this fight for the past 18 years. There are more of them in more places, they're resilient, and they're better informed and trained. Also, another point I wanted to make is every department and agency is seeking to have their own big data approach and systems, but they're doing so with only a fraction of the totality of relevant data. Duplication can be both inefficient and incomplete if it's not carefully curated, and that's only speaking for the CT mission. I'm sure it applies to other mission sets as well. Lastly, the ever-evolving terrorist landscape featuring the data challenges I've described this morning raises some key questions. How should we deal with massive amounts of information? What investments in technology, skills, and training do we need to make? How should we better integrate efforts to address big data challenges across departments and agencies? And finally, what are the data challenges, in addition to the legal and policy issues, that we face with regard to the domestic terrorism mission? While the FBI clearly has the lead in this space, we need to carefully assess how the intelligence community and the CT enterprise can appropriately be of assistance. These are important questions to address, and while we do that work, we can't shirk from our primary duty, and that duty for NCTC is to work to keep the homeland safe and keep it safe each and every day. And as they say, for us, failure is not an option. So thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you.
Thank you, John. For the past several years prior to assuming this role, I worked across the community to implement new reforms for privacy and civil liberties, especially with the intersection with big data. I can't begin to tell you how complex John's job is, and in large part because of his leadership in NSA and NCTC, he's led the charge for the IC and how we do this. We're now going to take a networking break. The exhibit hall is also open. We'll return at 10:30 with our IC CIO panel. Thank you.